Hello, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar. Today we want to share some insights and information around mobile driver's license, or mDL, and some of the foundational technologies that make it all work. And we'll be doing this from a couple of different perspectives. Socket Mobile is a mobile data capture company. We focus on capturing data in the physical world and delivering that data to apps to be used to make businesses more efficient. We have thousands of application developer partners around the world that have enabled the use of Socket data capture devices in their apps, whether those be our barcode scanners or our NFC or RFID reader writers. With all that's happening in the EID space and the mDL world, and how that world is starting to converge with the retail world, we felt the time was right to share some insights and education on this topic with our development partners. And we're very happy to have our friends from UL join us today to deliver the webinar. UL is a global safety science company that has been working to make the world a safer and more secure place for over 100 years. And UL has been instrumental in helping shape the mDL ecosystem and the standards that form the foundation for it all. So as for your speakers today, I'm Dave Holmes. I'm responsible for marketing and business development at Socket Mobile. I'll do a short intro into mDL and why it's timely and relevant for our partners. And as I said, I'm happy to be joined today by UL. Alice Chan is an advisor for UL's cybersecurity group, where she focuses on digital ID and payments. Alice will provide a technical overview of mDL and ISO 18013 and cover some of the tools that UL has available to help navigate the mDL journey. So before we dive in, I wanted to take a minute to go through a few housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded. We'll make the recording available to everyone that's participating shortly after the presentation. We'll post it on our website and send it via email. And second, for questions, we ask that you submit all your questions via the Q&A button on your screen. So if you click there, you should be able to put in whatever you need, and whatever is not clear. And in addition to Alice and I, we have some subject matter experts from UL and Socket participating behind the scenes to answer your questions in real time. So for any questions you have, just put them in there and they should be able to get back to you. For questions that we don't get addressed during the session, we'll follow up directly with you or include in the information when we post the recording and when we share that. So with that, the agenda for today. So I'll provide the introduction to sort of set the stage. What is mDL? Why should you care? Why now? And how Socket can help ensure that you're well positioned and ready for mDL hitting your world. And then I'll hand it over to Alice, and she'll cover the technical aspects, the data flows, privacy, security, as well as how UL fits into the overall mDL picture. So first, what is mDL? It is literally putting a digital version of your driver's license into your phone. So this isn't a new phenomenon, especially since the advent of NFC-enabled phones. We've been replacing things that we used to carry in our wallets and purses and pockets with digital credentials in the mobile wallets in our phones for quite some time. mDL is basically just another instance of this. So now we're going to take your driver's license or ID card and digitize it and put it in your wallet. So there's been a lot of activity in the space over the last few years. AMVA, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, has produced an mDL implementation guide, which is available on their website. It sort of acts as a blueprint for how to roll out mDL in your particular jurisdiction for all of the various players in the ecosystem, whether they be the mDL holder, the issuing authority, or authenticators trying to verify the credential. So the implementation guide is based on an ISO standard called ISO 18013. Alice will talk a lot more about that in her piece of the presentation. And the guide sort of outlines best practices to help ensure privacy, security, and interoperability. So the credential itself can be transmitted via NFC, like a mobile pass from your mobile wallet today. It can also be delivered as a QR code that can be displayed and scanned from your phone, right from the screen. So why do you need to know about this stuff? Mainly because it's coming to your doorstep. We want to make sure that you're armed with information to be ready to participate. You may have seen news about Apple and Google enabling EID or mDL in their wallets. I know Apple's talked a lot about being able to use your mDL at airports with TSA very soon. And several states have indicated that mDL is the first step in digitizing other government IDs or credentials as well, like specific licenses or healthcare cards, et cetera. As mDL began to pick up steam, the likelihood of it needing to be integrated into your POS app becomes more and more real. So there's a lot of news out there, but not a lot of information for relying parties. So what does this mean to me if I'm running a retail shop that sells tobacco, alcohol, cannabis? What do I do? What do I need to know? We hope to give you some of that information today to make you feel a little more comfortable of how you can participate in this. So for retail specifically, several credentials and use cases are converging on mobile. So payments is already happening. We have credit cards in our mobile wallets. Now loyalty cards, VAX verification, event or venue access and ticketing. mDL is yet another credential to consider. Of course, handling it has some special rules due to security and privacy associated with your driver's license and your identity. But done correctly, it can enable a whole new set of use cases like auditable electronic age verification or identity authentication from a trusted ID issuing authority. So we think the timing is right to have this conversation, mostly due to the momentum in the industry. So there've been lots of pilots, trials, a lot of proof of concept projects that have happened over the last few years. And importantly, the standard went from shaping, being in flux, to now being finalized. And that was really one of the tipping points for where the momentum started picking up steam. So as you can see from the latest map that I borrowed from the Smart Technology Alliance, there's dozens of states in the US that are already active. So it's happening right now. And it's not just the US. You can see that BC and Ontario and Canada also have mDL activities going on. South Korea, the Czech Republic, and other countries around the world are also getting into mDL, and there seems to be announcements every other week of new countries, new states that are sort of getting into this. So the timing is really now. And if you haven't already figured out your strategy of how to handle mDL with your app, you should probably add this to your near-term to-do list. And hopefully this webinar will help you get started. So Alice will get into the details of the mDL ecosystem in much more detail, but at a high level, it's essentially a three-corner model. The three pieces of the ecosystem in simple terms: you have the issuing authority. This is the state issuing the credential or the government authority issuing the credential, just like getting your license from the state DMV today. Second, you have the mDL holder. This is the credential itself, the license, as well as the person it belongs to and that person's mobile device. And it's safe to say that a lot of the activity that has been going on has been to ensure that the issuing piece and the mobile credential piece is handled properly. So between the states and the wallet providers and other players involved, there's a lot of work has been done to ensure that everything is smooth and secure. The final piece is of the ecosystem is where people call relying parties. And this is where the mDL reader needs to read the credential and pass it to the verifying app. and use that data to make decisions on whether to grant access to goods or services or not. So we believe this piece will require a lot of mDL readers in the market to work with these verifier apps. And at Socket, we have tried to simplify this piece as much as possible for our app partners. So our barcode scanners, our NFC readers, like the ones you see here on the screen, will work out of the box. So they already read the ISO 18013 credentials. That means you have, if you've integrated our Capture SDK into your app, any of our 2D barcode scanners or NFC readers will deliver mDL data to your app for processing. So no additional integrations required. If your app doesn't already have Capture SDK integrated, it's a great way to ensure that your data needs are met now and into the future without having to redo your app every time your end users' needs change. So with that, I will hand it over to Alice for a more detailed technical view. Alice.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen and start. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Now, in order to just kind of set the stage to get everyone on the same page, I will be going over the mDL ecosystem a little bit more in detail than what Dave just covered. So first, let's do that. So what you see on the screen here is the mDL ecosystem. So what exactly do we have in the mDL ecosystem? Well, first, we do have the issuing authority. Like Dave said, this is the one who will issue the mDL. It's really the same role they do today with the plastic driver license. So they will do the mDL data preparation, just like they do with the plastic driver's license, and they will issue the mDL. Note that they also might prepare electronic data because they might already have a chip card embedded in the plastic card. So like I said, they're already doing the electronic data preparation, and they would do the same thing for mDL, but it will be mDL specific and comply with ISO 18013 Part 5 as much as possible. And we're actually going to discuss the data elements later in the presentation. Down here on the left, we have the mDL application. This is the mobile application that will host and receive the mDL data that has been prepared by the issuing authority. Within this section here, we do have the mDL holder, that's you and I. We're the people who currently hold the physical driver's license, so we will also hold the mDL application. Here as well is the mobile device. It's also in scope, and that's what's going to host the mDL application, which could be downloaded from the Apple Store or the Google Store. Then on the right here, we have your mDL reader, the one that will get the information from the mDL. You can refer to this interaction kind of like a pin pad that will get information from a chip card if we were to relate it to the payment world. So same thing here. We actually have a verifier that will consume the information in order to unlock the service, and then the verifier will have to get the mDL reader in order to interact with the mDL. So how exactly does this all work? Well, first we actually have interface 1 here. This is between the mDL and the issuing authority. Now, keep in mind, this interface is not standardized and is actually currently under development, which is the 23220, which we won't cover in this presentation. But in this case, provisioning is in scope for that interface, meaning that the mDL data is going to be provisioned and prepared by the issuing authority and will be sent to the mDL application. And this is how the mDL will be ready to interface with any mDL reader, because all of your personal information will be there in the mDL application. The next interface is interface 2, which is between the mDL and the mDL reader. Now this is standardized under the ISO 18013 Part 5. The FDIS version has been published, and it provides direction on ISO 18013 Part 5 requirements. And the final interface is interface 3, which is between the issuing authority and the mDL reader. Now we will dive into this in an upcoming slide, so that will provide the requirements between these two entities. And like I said, these are the 3 main entities in the mDL ecosystem. So let's dive into the ISO and see exactly how it works. So in this, we're going to kind of break down the ISO 18013 Part 5 in more detail. But first, let's go to where it all kind of started. So what exactly is ISO 18013 Part 5? Well, actually, we have a specific task force, which is Task Force 14, that focuses on mobile driver's license specification, meaning the 18013 Part 5. Note that they do leverage the 18013 Parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are related to plastic cards and security and electronic driver's license. But Part 5 is specifically about the mobile driver's license. So what exactly do we have in Part 5? Well, we have the mDL overview and the data model, because we do need to understand what kind of data a reader should expect from an mDL reader. Excuse me, an mDL. We discussed the fact that the data does have to be prepared by the issuing authority and provisioned to the mDL. So even if interface 1 is not standardized, it has to be at least compliant with ISO 18013 Part 5, because here we actually define what might be expected from a reader's perspective. So if this data model is not provisioned, meaning what is optional or mandatory by an issuing authority, then we actually don't have a compliant mDL on interface 2, which is that bottom one that I talked about. Now, we'll dive into the data model some more later as well. But then on the screens here, you see that we have transactions. We do need to understand how a reader can interact with an mDL, or how an mDL can interact with the reader. We also have security mechanisms behind it. How exactly can we secure the interaction between the reader and the mDL? We'll go into more details there. And then, of course, we do have some annexes in the ISO 18013 Part 5 specification. So let's go into detail about how all of this works. All right, so first, let's go through the transaction flow between the mDL and the mDL reader. Now, the first step is the device engagement. Now, it's a step where the mDL reader and the mDL have to sync on the next steps. It's kind of like a handshake on how to communicate in order to retrieve the information. In this communication, they can decide between getting the mDL data from the issuing authority or directly from the mDL, which we will see in a later slide how that works. They also decide during the device engagement what type of technology would we leverage to retrieve that information. Note that per ISO, the device engagement has to be done through NFC or QR code. The reader has to support both, because the mDL might support NFC or QR code. Now in NFC, the reader will send a request through the NFC interface. ISO actually defines how that request should be formatted. And ISO also specifies the low-level network requirement, such as the handover and the request format. Now, in regards to QR code, the mDL will generate a QR code that will include all of the information required by the reader in order to establish the data retrieval session. And once they agree on that, then let's say during the device engagement, the outcome of that is to do a device retrieval, which is getting an mDL data from the actual device. So let's see on the next slide how that works. So here, what we've discovered or have discussed is the device engagement is now completed, and the outcome of that device engagement is the device retrieval. So here, the device retrieval means that we're going to get the data from the mDL. Now, for the device retrieval, there's going to be 3 options in terms of establishing a connection. Now, we can do Bluetooth, low energy, Wi-Fi aware, and NFC. Again, the mDL has to support one of them. The mDL reader has to support both NFC and Bluetooth, with Wi-Fi aware being optional. Now, after the device engagement, the mDL reader will know that it needs to send a request to the mDL by leveraging one of these technologies. We say technologies because this is the support that will support the request, meaning that at the application level, at the application level. ISO 18013 Part 5 actually also specifies how the request should be formatted. So for example, depending on the use case, the request will state what needs to be included in the request in order to comply with privacy and security requirements. Now let's take a look at what happens if after the device engagement, we decide to do a server retrieval instead. And that's what this is going to cover. So like I said, the outcome of the device engagement decides to get the data from the issuing authority instead, which in this case is called a server retrieval. Now, in terms of technology, they will leverage Web API and OpenID Connect in order to establish a communication between the verifier and the issuing authority. Note that Web API and OpenID Connect are not mDL specific. We actually use these technologies in the online ecosystem every day. So the mDL will issue a token, which is leveraged by the reader and verifier, and will provide that token to the issuing authority. Then the issuing authority will leverage the token received from the verifier in order to retrieve the mDL account information and reply with the information that was requested. Next, we're going to take a look at the security mechanisms covered in the ISO 18013 Part 5. So the first one that we're going to discuss is issuer data authentication. Issuer data authentication ensures the authenticity of mDL data. An mDL reader must be able to verify that the data actually really originates from the issuing authority and has not been changed in any way. So in this case, the issuer will sign the data. The signed data will be provisioned in the mDL, and then the issuer will share its public key with the verifier through the VICAL, which stands for Verified Issuing Certificate Authority List. And that list will contain all of the issuing authority certificate authority root certificates that will be leveraged by the verifier in order to authenticate the data signed by the issuer. So then this data is in the mDL, and during the transaction, this data will be sent to the verifier, and then the verifier will leverage the issuing authority certificate root authority, issuing authority certificate authority root certificate in order to authenticate this data. The second one here is the mDoc authentication, which is down here, which is for anti-cloning. So essentially to ensure that the mDL is not a copy of another mDL. Now, during the transaction, the mDoc will sign the specific data elements and share that with the verifier. And by leveraging the public key infrastructure, the verifier will be able to authenticate the data elements signed by this mDoc. And the public key that will be provided to the verifier is included in the data elements signed by the issuer. Now, the next one here is the mDoc reader authentication. Similar to the mDoc authentication, we might need the reader to authenticate itself to the mDL. This is actually optional in the ISO 18013 Part 5. The mDoc will get the reader certificate and we will be able to authenticate the reader certificate leveraging the trusted list that is provisioned in the mDoc by the issuing authority. The next one on here is session encryption. Now, this is to make sure that no one is able to spy or listen in on the conversation between the mDoc and the mDoc reader. The mDoc and the mDoc reader will both generate a key pair that is specific for this transaction, and they will end up with a private key that will be leveraged to encrypt the information that is shared by the mDoc and the mDoc reader. And then finally, we have the TLS, which stands for Transport Layer Security, and JWS, which stands for JSON Web Signature. Now, these are the same mechanism leveraged in the web ecosystem, and this is to authenticate the communication. Also, the JWS will be leveraged to authenticate data received from the issuer. Next, we'll discuss privacy is also covered in the ISO 18013 Part 5. Here on the screen is actually a non-exhaustive list of privacy requirements as expressed in Annex E of ISO 18013 Part 5. Privacy is achieved by the end-to-end solution and with the participation of all the participants in the ecosystem. Now, each actor in the mDL ecosystem should fulfill their role in a responsible manner that best protects PII. Now, the privacy principles on this slide were taken into consideration during protocol design. And each entity in the mDL ecosystem must understand privacy and scope for themselves. So for instance, the verifier should make sure that they comply with collection limitation and data protection, which are in scope for the GDPR or CCPA that's in California. In the next slide, we'll actually see how these principles kind of fit into the ecosystem as well. So we'll cover quite a few here. So first we'll start with data minimization. This is where processing of data should be minimized to that specifically necessary for the purpose that's specified. Then we have collection limitation. This is where the data controller and data processors should only collect the data that's necessary for their purpose and should only collect data consistent with those principles. Next is consent and choice. This is where the data subject must consent to the processing of their personal data in an mDL transaction. And then we have a list here. I'll go through them individually. The first one is information security. This is where personal data should be protected by security safeguard against such risk as loss or unauthorized access, destruction, use, modification, or disclosure. We also have on there individual participation and access. This is where the data subject should be involved in the collection, consent, processing, and storage management of their personal data. We also have information security of data subject relating to unlinkability. Linkability through mDoc authentication keys can be reduced by frequent updates of mDoc authentication keys. So if the same server retrieval tokens are used multiple times, care should be taken that they do not serve as a means to link the mDL. And I think the last one on the screen is accuracy and quality. High accuracy of data being processed and held is in the best interest of the data subject, and processors should take measures to ensure accuracy. Now that we covered that, we are going to hop into the data model. So what you see on the screen here is the mDL data model. The first thing here is the doc type. And the doc type is the master. And as we can see on the screen, that this doc type is an mDL. So when a reader interacts with the mDL first, they interact with the doc type in order to access the namespace that has the data elements that we need. So the document type field follows a general format, which is reverse domain dot domain specific extension. Now the reverse domain here is org.iso and was selected to avoid collision. And this approach can be used to define other doc types as well. And then the reverse domain here is org.iso. You do see here that we have namespaces here, and you can tell it's namespaces for an mDL because it will say org.iso.18013.5.1. And here we actually have two namespaces. Now the first namespace we see here is the org.iso.18013.5.1, meaning that this namespace belongs to ISO, meaning that if we look into the 18013 part 5 documentation, we'll see which data elements are mandatory and which ones are optional. Here on the screen, on the left-hand side, we see a few data elements with family name, given name, sex, and height. Now the second namespace here, the org.iso.18013.5.1.AMVA, means that AMVA has actually provided a customized namespace. So AMVA specific data elements are listed here. Now this is not the full list, but some AMVA specific data elements are listed here with audit information, organ donor, veteran, and AMVA version. Now keep in mind, again, none of these are the full list of the data elements. We'll see a few more on the other slide, but you'll have to look into the document for more. So if the reader, let's say, is specifically looking for information regarding organ donor, they will need to specify the AMVA namespace in their request in order to obtain this data element. So you kind of understand that this is just like a file structure where we have directories like the doc type, and under that directory we have several files that can be referred to as namespaces. So in order to get the information you need to be under the right directory, under the right namespace or file to request that information that you want. This is just a short list. Again, it's not the full list of an example of the mandatory and optional data elements in the ISO namespace. Again, not the full list. If a data element is defined as mandatory, the reader should request that data element to the mDL, and that data element should have been provisioned to the mDL. So unless the mDL holder declines the request, the mDL should be able to reply with that data element. If it's an optional data element, the reader, while requesting the optional data element, might receive an error message stating that this data element is not available in this mDL. All right, so now we're going to go through some of the use cases that is covered in the ISO 18013 Part 5. So according to ISO 18013 Part 5, we have what we refer to as mDL Day 1 or attended use cases. Day 2 are under development, and they will refer to as unintended use cases, kind of like opening a bank account from a mobile device, unintended authentication like smart car lock, and on-device authentication, which is opening a bank account from a mobile banking app. And these will be in scope for ISO 18013 Part 7. But let's focus on day 1 because that's what's covered in ISO 18013 Part 5. Any use cases we have with the plastic driver license, we should expect the same for ISO 18013 Part 5. So here we have law enforcement, purchase age-restricted items, enter restricted venue, checked into a hotel, car rental or sharing, airport security, and voting and being able to register to vote. So we will look at what type of data elements do we share when we go through these use cases with our plastic driver license and how mDL will impact these use cases. For the sake of time, we are just going to use one use case as an example. All right, so let's use this use case of purchasing age-restricted item. Now, what is in scope for this use case? Well, we have an mDL holder referred to here as the subject, and we have a verifier that is about to sell an age-restricted item like tobacco or alcohol, and we have an mDL that has been provisioned on the holder's mobile device. Now, what are the data elements requested by the verifier in order to proceed with the sale? Well, for this specific use case, the verifier needs to validate age attestation or date of birth, that the holder is old enough to purchase the restricted item. We also need facial image in order to proceed with the verification and validation of this intended use case. And during the transaction request, let's say we do a device retrieval. The verifier will tell the mDL what type of data is requested. So for example, the age attestation or date of birth. In order to comply with the data minimization and data collection, the verifier needs to only request the data that's needed for this use case. Now we refer to this as collection limitation. Now, other data elements like zip code are not relevant for this use case, so they're not going to be requested. Here you do see on the screen, we have a third thing here is the intent to retain. Now, with the intent to retain in the ISO specification 18013 Part 5, we actually have a privacy requirement where the verifier needs to tell the holder if that data will be stored or retained in the verifier system. It also needs to comply with the local and regional data protection laws, as we do have some in the US. Verifiers should also be aware of these data protection laws as it will impact these use cases. Now, upon the reception of the request, the mDL should display all of the data elements requested by the verifier in order for the mDL holder to provide the approval to share it. Now, once we get that approval, only these data elements will be shared with the verifier. So you can see the enhancement for this specific use case. Today, with the plastic driver's license, we hand the plastic driver's license to the cashier, and that plastic driver's license holds more than the needed information for this specific transaction, like first name, last name, address, and more. So by implementing mDL, it would actually enhance the privacy and security for this specific use case and all of the other use cases that we haven't gone over. Right? Let's see. So now that we understand the importance of security and privacy, we need to make sure that the mDL reader and the mDL comply with the ISO specification. Now, in regards to privacy, we have all these data protection laws, like intent to retain is very important. If we're referring to the GDPR or the CCPA, which is the California Data Protection Law, it means that the mDL reader must have access to the data. So how exactly do we make sure that the reader will send the intent to retain, for example, to the mDL holder? Now, we have to test that implementation, and that's where the EID scheme comes into play. Now, the objective here is to evaluate compliancy for reader and mDL application against the ISO standard. So what do we have in the ISO standard? We have technology like the device engagement that has to be done through QR code and NFC. The reader has to support both again. So how exactly we make sure that the reader won't run into interoperability issues in the field. We actually have to test it. And that's what the EID scheme is about. It will test that the reader is according to the ISO standard. Now the description here includes the reader and the mDL test suites adjusted to the system under test and the functionalities implemented. Now, remember, according to ISO, some functionalities are optional, like the mDoc reader authentication I mentioned earlier. But if you don't support it, then you won't test it. So this is what the EID is about, to generate test cases based on the scope. And we will refer to that as the implementation performance statement form that we'll talk about in the next slide a little bit as well. So this is how the test process works. So first, you will have to define your scope for testing. You will have that implementation conformance statement form to be filled out with the functionalities supported, including the optional functionalities that you support. In regards to security testing, the VICAL, which again is the Verified Issuer Certificate Authority List, is in scope for testing, and verifier certificate will be in scope according to the ICS document form that I mentioned earlier. Now, in order to successfully validate security mechanisms, the test tool will need to be configured with these certificates. The data model is also validated. We saw that we have mandatory and optional data elements, and this will be in scope based on the optional data elements that you have implemented. And of course, the testing will cover the mandatory data elements as well. The next step, once we have an understanding of the configuration, then the test cases are generated. Then UL will execute the test cases. The EID scheme is created based on the ISO FDIS documentation that has been published in September of last year, 2021. But like any other test tools, it will have to evolve according to the specification updates. Now, we do anticipate a 2-week turnaround on test results depending on the scope of testing. And the scope of testing will also drive the number of test cases to run. So the more you support, the more test cases you have, so that will affect the test execution timeline. So the customer will be provided with a report that clearly outlines the outcome of the test. So if, let's say, you don't meet the ISO requirements, as in you have non-conforming results from the test cases, recommendations will be provided for the system under test to be fixed in order to comply with the ISO specification. And then at the end, what do you have? You will get a certificate of pass delivered by UL. Keep in mind that UL has worked in the standardization and certification ecosystem in many verticals for over a century now, including payments and building construction. So you will have the same thing here. You will be provided with a certificate that you've been tested by UL according to the ISO standard. And then your reader or mDL application complies with the ISO standards. You will receive a certificate from UL that might be used to show your customers that your reader or mDL application complies with the ISO standard, and therefore they can implement your solution safely. On the left here, we have the UL mDL application test suite. So we can see what's in scope for the mDL application test suite, which includes the device engagement and data transfer. Note that we are referring to the ISO 18013 Part 5 because, again, as an mDL application test suite, this system is under test. So interface 1 is also in scope, but the certificate is more about compliancy with ISO 18013 Part 5, which is why only device engagement and data transfer are in scope for the UL mDL application system under test. On the right-hand side, we have the UL mDL reader application test suite. And here we have the online retrieval here, or we refer to as server retrieval in our earlier slides, which is in scope. And the device retrieval are also in scope, which means that the device engagement and data transfer are in scope as well. Note that as an mDL reader application, what is not in scope is the integration between the mDL reader application and the verifier, meaning that once you retrieve the mDL data and comply with the security mechanisms, and you know how to process the data model in interfaces 2 and 3, how you actually process these data are not in scope for ISO 18013 Part 5. And that's just another level of integration between the reader and the verifier's back office. But as a verifier, just make sure to validate the data protection and scope for you. And hopefully I didn't go through that too quickly. There was a lot to cover, but let us know if you have any questions, but that's the end of my section here. I'll pass the baton back to you, Dave.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Alice. That was great. There's a lot of information, and I know we packed it into a pretty short amount of time. So thanks for sticking with us there. And it looked like we did have a handful of questions. I think Honore was able to kind of knock those out in real time. I don't see any outstanding questions remaining. So, however, our contact information is in the slides, and that we'll be sharing, and we'll post them on our website. We'll be emailing them to the participants. So you'll have our contact information there. Please feel free to reach out if the answers that you received today weren't clear enough, or if you have any questions that arise after this, just reach out anytime. You'll know where to find us. So thanks again for your interest. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Alice and Honore. And with that, we will close the session.